Warning, this fic contains many dark and adult themes. For the full list provided by the author, please check the description below and proceed with caution. Welcome back, this is Falling for You by 1967 Hogwarts Goddess, a Percy Jackson fanfic. Don't forget to like this video if you enjoy and subscribe for future stories. Please check the description for a full list of tags and the link to drop a kudos for the original author. With that out of the way, let's get started. Chapter 14. Percy IX. Percy breathed out slowly and ran his hand through his dirty hair for about the 100th time that minute. He didn't know if he could take it anymore. Camper was gone, but the sting from her tail haunted both Damieson and Percy long after her death. Unable to move, the giant lay slumped on the ground, face down. And it wasn't as if Percy could move him, a whole 10 tons of giant being just a little too above his weight class for him to just flip him over his shoulder and keep them moving. The river flowed unnaturally silently next to them, setting him just a little more on edge, but at least monsters couldn't attack them from that side. It didn't take long for Percy to realize that he hated staying in one place. He felt like a target was painted on his back, and cursed himself for not being able to just pick Damieson up. It wasn't his fault, Damieson was a giant. He glanced around warily again. Exposed on the riverbank, they were too open, too vulnerable. They'd both been sat there for days, weeks perhaps. He listened as Damieson let out another gut-wrenching yell, the poison coursing in a new wave through his veins. The pain was said to be unimaginable, but the screams seemed to help Percy's imagination. "Let it out, buddy," Percy mumbled, sending a sympathetic glance from his position atop a rock he had been using as a lookout. "I'll protect us, don't worry." He didn't know if Damieson could hear him. The giant was writhing on the floor, seemingly unaware of anything or anyone. After he had been stung, he'd been quiet for a few minutes, and Percy had mistakenly thought that it had just knocked him out. Turned out Damieson had been holding his breath, teeth clenched together in agony. He'd given in after a while to voice his pain. Loudly, his wails sounded wrong and unnatural, setting Percy's nerves on edge. It was like sitting near a siren call for monsters. He had a thick coat of gold dust on his biceps as a testament to that. Damieson's screams attracted what felt like every ugly sucker from every corner of Tartarus, all looking for a wounded giant. Instead, they just found an angry demigod. Percy wasn't worried about himself when they came. The Achilles curse made his skin a rival of some of Hephaestus' greatest metal creations, and he had very little to be concerned about in a fight. But he wasn't omnipresent. He couldn't do a perimeter check and guard over Damieson at the same time. It didn't help that monsters thought traveling in packs was safest. They could swarm him, cutting him off from the paralyzed giant. Slicing through them was like waving his hand through water, but a second was all it could take for them to take away another of his friends. Good thing they focused on him instead. Percy craned his neck around, doing his regular scans for monsters. A thick feeling of paranoia plagued him. With his improved Achilles hearing, a stone could be kicked quite some distance away and Percy would have his swords out before it could even land. Monsters growled, shaking themselves off, but Percy's hand had already curled around the handle of his fallen sword. Not even bothering to think, Percy flung himself at the nearest one, tackling it to the ground. His sword ran through the leathery skin, and Percy rolled through the cloud of gold, coming up to slash at the surprised beasts. He didn't even recognize what they were. Kicking one in the knee, he brought the other one down with a powerful strike before beheading the other one. He'd forgotten how good the Achilles curse could make him. Even after he had lost it when going into Camp Jupiter, he felt he had retained some of the speed. The wild, fluid technique that had made him stand out so much against the order of the Roman legion. Watching the last monster dissipate into the air, Percy finally let himself breathe out. He strode back over to Damieson, a tension building in his head. A mix of exhaustion and adrenaline fought in his head, and he couldn't shake the constant feeling that something was watching him. He knew it was. He could feel its eyes constantly burning into him. Well, whatever it was, he tried to comfort himself grimly. He'd kill it. He sat down heavily onto the ground next to the giant, his limbs giving out. He felt lightheaded, his stomach rumble. Percy blacked out. The ogre picked him up before he could even open his eyes, filthy fingers around his waist. He slammed Percy to the ground again and again. Percy let himself be thrown around for a couple seconds longer. It wasn't as if he felt it, he argued in his head. Then, when he had regained his bearings from quite possibly the worst alarm clock wake-up he'd ever encountered, he pulled out his sword and cut the ogre's hand off. He landed on the ground with a thump. The ogre's head followed shortly after. His stomach gnawed at him from the inside. He glanced at Maya as she stripped the meat off of the bones of a monster he had subdued. It suddenly didn't look like the worst thing in the world. It looked more than edible. knockoff KFC chicken tenders. Percy reverted his gaze back to the river and shook his head to try and clear it. When Maya slept, her snores were comforting to have in the background. When she was awake, she hissed under her breath every now and then. When she was gone, off hunting for food or for a walk, there was nothing but silence and the churning of the river. Percy hated silence. His leg bounced. Percy sighed and reached into the leathery bag around Maya's neck for a draken steak. He scowled at the rubbery meat. Damason had claimed that it was cooked, but the black liquid seeping out of it in places did nothing to reassure him. Percy flattened it on the ground, hoping the hot stones would at least do something to it. After a few seconds, Percy couldn't stand it anymore. He lifted it up to face level. He hoped the Achilles curse protected him from salmonella. He looked down after he killed the monster, and grimaced as he noticed that one of his jean legs had become jean shorts. Percy couldn't stop himself from glaring at Damason as the giant writhed unconsciously, the same moans and hoarse cries slipping out of him. "Shut up," Percy hissed before running a hand through his hair, regretting it immediately even if no one heard him. "Sorry," he mumbled. He buried his face in his hand and closed his eyes, dimly aware of the nearby Dracaena thinking it was sneaking up on him. His eyes were beginning to sting again. He needed to sleep. The curse always made him more tired than he should be, and down in Tartarus by all rights he should be absolutely dead on his feet. But Maya was gone again and he needed someone to watch his back. Percy didn't realize how dependent he had become on Damason and Bob. He ran a hand over his sword to distract himself. He missed the fine flat sides of Riptide, the lightweight feel of it, effortlessly polished and ready to slice. The sword he'd made had served him well, but it was a mess of gritty bronze metal and sharp points at random places along the blade. Even the handle itself was spiky in some places. He could feel himself forming new calluses on his palms. But it was Riptide's ability to return to him that he missed most, and he rubbed a hand against his forehead as he tried to think about a way to recreate that. Brainstorming was never a particularly good skill of his. A sudden, impulsive plan, sure, but not meticulously thinking. He guessed he could tie a bit of string to the handle and attach it to his wrist. That could have worked if he had any string. What he really wanted was to be able to stretch his hand and just have it fly straight back. Being unarmed down in Tartarus was the worst feeling. Percy racked his brains, feeling a slightly Annabeth-esque voice in his head encouraging him to think harder. What could he do? He could control water, but unless he put some on the sword somehow. Or inside. Percy frowned as he thought. He could melt the handle and put water inside. Percy couldn't stop thinking about the idea. He took out the bottle of Phlegethon water. It was for injuries on Maya or Damason, but Percy had already decided that they wouldn't get hurt in the first place with him there. Doing another scan, Percy couldn't see any monsters. In plain sight anyway. He propped the sword up on an angle and slowly started dripping parts of the Phlegethon onto the handle to make it squishy and malleable. While before he had used rocks to bash and smooth everything into place, he just used his bare hands this time. He could feel the heat under his fingertips, but none of the pain that would usually come when mixing bare hands with molten metal. Tongue stuck out, he formed a small well in the handle, hollowing it out a little. He put it back on the ground, hurrying over to the sticks to scoop up a handful of the black water. Before the metal could set, he dripped it into the divot. He added a drop or two of the Phlegethon water for good luck, getting flashbacks to himself as a kid mixing all the shampoos and soaps together in the bathroom, claiming to his fondly exasperated mother that he was making a potion. Feeling the water start to react to the colder water, he pushed it all back together, trapping the water firmly inside. Percy raised the sword up, checking it out, feeling proud. The balance was more off than ever, but it would do. He tossed it a few feet in front of him, then tried to summon it back. Locking onto the water, the sword flew straight back to him. The blade smacked him in the nose and fell into his waiting hands. Percy blinked. "That could have been bad if I didn't have the blessing," he mumbled, rubbing his nose. He walked back to Damason, pouring a little of the Phlegethon water onto where he had been stung. The wound on his back was ugly and streaked with black. Damason groaned loudly, digging his hands into the rock below him. "I'm sorry," Percy said apologetically, "but it's healing you faster." Damason didn't respond, just went back to his low groaning. Percy prayed it would be over soon. He couldn't stay here any longer. Sure, the venom could knock someone out for hours, but down here, he knew it could have been days or weeks since it had happened. He wasn't even sure how long he'd been down here in the first place. Sometimes it felt just like a really long and really bad day, but sometimes it felt like a couple of months. Bob had always been annoyingly vague in his answers about time, but Percy understood now. There was no way to measure time, no rise and fall of the sun and the moon. They didn't exist down here. Percy didn't have a watch, but if he did, he had a strong feeling that it would just be spinning in circles or even going backwards. The ancient Greeks were right, this was hell, Percy sighed. He sat down next to Maya again and pushed his eyelids open with his fingers to stay awake. He scanned the area for threats again. Chapter 15. Percy X. Damasen's shouts of agony had finally broken his voice, the ragged groans flickering like a TV with faulty volume. Percy was sat down on the ground, leaning his back onto the sleeping Draken behind him. While they camped out, Maya had opened up to Percy and he found that he liked the Draken. She was strangely lovable. She wasn't fluffy or cuddly, but she seemed to treat him like a child. When she wandered off every now and then, often she would bring back anonymous hunks of meat, nudging some in his direction. Percy ate them with a wince, but without question. Shortly after realizing that they were in for the long haul, Percy had attempted to build a sort of shelter, but his resources were limited, and he just ended up shoving a circle of boulders around them. He slept in short intervals, and though he had once woken to a pterodactyl-type beast trying to jam its long beak into his eyes, the piles of gold dust around him told him that Maya had protected him from others when he was asleep. Since then, they'd set up a kind of rota. He slept, she protected, she slept, and he protected. Monsters came and went, but none survived. It was his turn to protect now. He was slouched, but there was no mistaking his posture for inattention. If they looked and looked properly, anyone could see the sea-green eyes flicking around at the slightest noise, the death grip on the swords, the tapping foot. His legs were outstretched and his remaining jean leg was in ribbons below his knee from the constant monster attacks. Damasen's screams of pain echoed in his head, even during the rare moments when the giant was quiet. He absently flicked the skin canvas bag that was tied around Maya's neck. It was crammed with meat Maya had brought now, along with the Draken steaks at the bottom, some smaller weapons Damasen had brought along, and a couple cool-looking rocks Percy had put in for Annabeth. When Damasen finally went silent and that silence began to stretch out for too long, Percy turned to look at him, back straightening. He clambered to his feet, slowly approaching him. "Damasen," Percy said, fearful that the giant had died. He held his breath, hearing nothing but his own heartbeat for several long seconds. Damasen huffed out a light sigh. Percy breathed out, grinning in relief. He sank back on his heels, letting his shoulders slump. The giant curled up into himself a bit and his white eyes blearily fluttered open, so similar to his giant brothers. Finally, thought Percy, Damasen was moving and didn't seem to be in pain. That meant they could finally get him up and keep going. Maya, Percy gave a long, sharp whistle in the direction of the Draken and her head came up. They'd agreed on that being a signal that he needed her, whereas her signal for him was usually just to nudge him and send him flying. Honestly, she was lucky he couldn't get hurt anymore. "Damasen, we're going to move you, okay?" He patted the giant softly. "I'm gonna need you to help do some of the work. We can't do this without you." "HGNMPH," Damasen grunted, staring blearily at him. Percy took that as a yes. With great difficulty and a frustrating language barrier, Maya and Percy strained and worked together to lift Damasen onto Maya's back. They heaved him into a sitting position, then kneeling, then crouching. The giant, in his defense, did try. His legs weakly supported his body through his attempt to stand up, hands fumbling to hold himself upright. Trying to avoid hurting him, Percy took a slight hold on Damasen's blood to lift him. Damasen groaned. Eventually, they had the giant sprawled on the Draken. Percy reached up and wrapped the reins around one of Damasen's large hands to anchor him slightly. He gave the whole scene a once-over appraisingly, putting his hands in his surprisingly intact pockets. "You okay?" Percy said softly to Maya. She'd supported him no problem, but Percy weighed just a little less than a massive giant. The Draken batted him roughly in the chest, and Percy smiled fondly at her. They set off at a surprisingly quick pace, Percy leading. He guessed Maya wanted to leave just as much as he did and felt a wave of gratitude towards her as he realized that she had no real reason to come back to him. He was sure she'd do fine on her own down here. He patted her gently on her side. She hissed at him. "Love you too," he murmured, the trio reaching the peak of the hill they were walking up. He had no clue if they were going the right way, but going past the river Styx seemed like a bad idea, so he tried to head away from it. Trusting his gut seemed like the only plan he had. He'd guess he was going east if he had any idea which direction that was. Similar to a watch, he also felt like a compass would be going haywire down here. Damieson swayed in and out of consciousness flat out on Maya's back, but he otherwise seemed out of the woods pain-wise, even having a couple brief whispered conversations with Percy. They weren't exactly Shakespearean monologues though, more of a shorter water, yes, here, thanks style interaction. As they walked and walked and walked, Percy thought dismally of the soles of his shoes. They'd be paper-thin soon. Heads popped out of caves as they passed, tentacles leaned over cliffs, eyes stared unblinkingly from the darkness. Percy watched them out the corner of his eye. He knew their little parade wasn't exactly incognito mode, but he prayed they'd just let them pass unheeded. His prayers clearly were getting lost in the mail. Packs of monsters followed them. Granted, most stayed back, prowling in the shadows, waiting for them to slip up. Some were bolder and jumped them, quickly meeting their demise before even getting within 6 feet of Maya and Damieson. Percy's grip never faltered on his swords. The thing about the curse of Achilles was the balancing. Sure, Percy could probably get run over by a tank and live, and then proceed to punch dents in said tank without a care in the world. But the curse required balance. Great spending of energy during a fight meant a lot less energy during downtime. Percy was tiring quickly. He wasn't sure how many days they'd been walking for, but he could feel his knees buckling, his eyes trying to roll back into the comforting darkness of the inside of his skull. This wasn't unfamiliar. He remembered the intense need to sleep vividly from last time he had the blessing. The amount of times he dozed off on Annabeth or took a quick nap in between tasks back at camp. One minute he'd be telling some kid of Demeter that his sword grip was wrong, the next he'd be yawning and dismissing the class altogether. It hadn't changed after Hera either. His weeks on the run from Uriel and Estheno caught him sleeping in doorways, in trees. He'd actually been sleeping in the cop car he'd borrowed before he'd had to crash it into them. He knew he didn't have long before the Achilles curse would force him to sleep and he would collapse like last time. Physical exertion made the tiredness increase exponentially. "We need to stop," Percy said absently. He didn't really know who he was talking to, but the lack of conversation made him uneasy, so occasionally he talked to himself or to Maya and just pretended she was replying. When they walked in dead silence, all he could hear was his pulse in his ears, and to him it always sounded like heavy footfalls following them. He looked around, searching for high ground or some kind of cave-type shelter. Clearing out a cave full of monsters did not sound like a party, but they just needed somewhere safe to crash. No such luck. The ground around them was a long and level plain of black spikes, a few jutting rocks every now and then, but unfortunately no hills or caves in sight. Just the lazy red mist that hovered above them and in the distance, blocking out any sights. If he didn't keep track of which direction they were heading in, it was likely that they could end up walking back to the sticks without realizing. Nothing was identical, but everything looked the same. Percy breathed out hard through his nose, frustrated and worn out. "We'll have to stay here," he mumbled, running a hand through his hair like Annabeth and his mum used to do to calm him down sometimes. Though their hands were probably cleaner, Percy reflected, gazing at the blood-flecked and grubby hands curled around his weapons. The ground trembled for a beat as Maya slumped down, impervious to the glassy rocks. Percy gave the long stretch they were on one last glare. He hated being so unprotected like this. It made him want to curl up into himself, but they had to rest or they'd never be able to get there. To the doors, he reminded himself angrily. It was getting too easy to forget where he was going, where he was coming from, what the point of it all was. A tight frown on his face, he knelt down to sit against Maya, his head resting on her side. He needed to get Damieson to safety. He needed to. "Hey." Percy stopped himself. He bit his lip and chewed it for a few minutes, shredding the skin mercilessly with his teeth. The same thought had been bouncing around in his mind ever since Damieson had been stung, drilling into his brain and keeping him awake even when it was his turn to sleep. He hated thinking it. He didn't want to think it. Leave him. Percy couldn't, he knew he couldn't. Damieson had saved his life, had been there for him when without help Percy would have died from blood loss. He was peaceful, he was his friend, but Percy couldn't help it. He knew deep down that he should just go. Damieson was dead weight like this, and though it looked like he was on the mend, how long would it be before he was fully mobile? The same amount of time, weeks of just sitting around letting his paranoia consume him. Longer, Percy was torn. He had helped Percy when he had no one else except Bob, and Bob wasn't the most useful. Percy didn't want the guilt on his conscience of leaving him stranded out here to recover. Didn't want to leave him stranded in the first place. Something would find him, and Percy had seen what happened to the weak down here. Damieson didn't deserve that. The hands running through his hair increased in pressure until Percy was tugging on it. Could he be that cold, that callous? Because if he was to leave, he would take Maya with him, no doubt about it, and Damieson would be alone. She was up and running fine and could go a hell of a lot faster than him on foot. Abandon Damason and make it back to his family as soon as he could, or stay and travel slower while Damason, his friend, healed. Percy didn't want to make a choice, he just didn't. He shook his head. His eyes were fluttering shut like weights were tied to his was too tired. If Maya saw anything, Percy was sure she would wake him up. Or at least that's what he told himself as he tucked his knees under his chin, getting as comfy as he could. He'd always had the ability to sleep wherever, so it didn't matter to him whether he was laying on a mattress, a draken, or the ground of Tartarus, just as long as he got some shut-eye. Percy closed his eyes and let the darkness envelop him. He jumped headfirst into sleep. There was no drifting, just out like a light switch. And he found himself dreaming. He could tell instantly it wasn't a normal, naked at school kind of dream. There was a sense of being awake and lucid, but it didn't seem like a normal demigod dream either. In his dream he span around searching for anything. But it was all pitch black, a level of darkness similar to the sticks surrounding him. He couldn't see his hand when he waved it an inch from his face, not even the barest outline. It was too dark, Percy thought with a flare of panic at being snuck up on. Too dark, too dark, too dark. He sunk to his knees and plummeted forwards, the floor disappearing. He was falling again, away from home, from Earth, from his family. He flipped in the air uncontrollably and Percy strained to end the dream but couldn't. A familiar voice echoed behind his falling body. He craned his neck round with great difficulty as he plummeted. "Such a shame too, I heard the gods liked this one," said a huge Hades at the edge of the surface, holding something in his hand, something that glinted gold. Percy woke up with a start, limbs jolting like someone had pressed a defibrillator to his chest on full power. Or that time he had high-fived a charged-up Jason. He jumped to his feet, pulling out his swords before he even knew what was going on. Maya watched him with one eye lazily cracked open from where she was sprawled. Apart from her and Damason, there were no monsters in sight, just black ground, black sky, and a receding red cloud above them. Percy tried to still his frantic heart, recalling his dream instead, going through it in his head. What was Hades talking about? An object, a person, what was the gold? Gold like the Apollo cabin, like the weapons of the Roman legion, gold like Annabeth's hair. He shook his head. He was getting sidetracked. Gold always linked to something in Percy's memory, and he couldn't help but see the glinting eyes of Kronos. He's gone, Percy thought quietly to himself, he's gone. It would be a while before Kronos would turn up again, hopefully after his lifetime. Long after, but if Bob and Hyperion were down here, fully reformed was he. In a gold bubble somewhere waiting, hatching, rising, ready to take over again. No, Percy shook his head. Hades had made it clear he felt no allegiance to Kronos. The guy had eaten him as a baby, and it was someone or something that the gods liked. A weapon, a demigod, their thrones. Percy kicked a rock, startling Maya, who let out an indignant snort. Damason gave a snuffle and Percy lowered his swords reluctantly. He slipped the bronze one onto his belt loops. He observed the giant with a pained expression. If he killed him now, Damason wouldn't know it was him, and he could still leave. No, stop. Percy shook his head fiercely at his own thoughts, reaching up to run a hand through his hair again. Damason was his friend, nothing changed that. He'd done nothing to harm him when he did every reason to. Percy had killed a lot of his family members, and besides he didn't know if he could even kill Damason on his own anyway, not without a god. Though in Tartarus he wasn't sure if those rules applied anymore. It felt like a massive free-for-all for everyone. You could at least try, his mind said. No, Percy replied firmly. Cut him loose and run, his mind countered. Shut up, Percy thought angrily. All the arguments taking place in his head, if this was how the gods were feeling, Percy might actually come close to sympathizing with them. He could see himself now, looking down at the sleeping giant, an indecipherable expression on his face before stabbing Damason in the eyes, one sword for each, then shoving him to the ground. He'd then swing up onto Maya, give her a slap on the back, and they'd shoot off, leaving the bleeding giant on the floor. Percy tried to bring himself back to the present, tried to escape the scenarios that plagued his mind. Damason was back to being out cold, but the giant's hands kept twitching. Whether it was a good sign or a bad sign, Percy didn't know. He chose to see it as a good sign. He tightened the knots keeping Damason in place to take his mind off it all and did the mandatory scan. The blood-tinted fog had risen slightly, exposing shapes in the not-too-far distance. One dark, almost square structure had lazily wafted into view, along with a rise in the terrain, cliff sides that grew in height. It was about as big as the nail on Percy's smallest finger, so he knew it was far away, but it was also within sight. It was somewhere to aim for, rather than just wandering aimlessly, hopping to find the Phlegthon River again. If it wasn't anything of importance, it could at least be a place to camp out, Percy reasoned. He patted Maya, who huffed but stood up. They walked quickly, Percy even wishing that monsters would appear, so at least he'd have something to actively fight instead of feeling like he was walking towards some convoluted trap. The building got bigger and more defined as they got closer. It almost looked like some kind of temple. Mountain-like areas were starting to appear again, dips and curves to go up and down. Cliffs that framed their walk almost like a path. Percy didn't like walking in the chasm parts. He felt trapped and herded in one direction, and as they walked cautiously through it, Percy's grips on his swords got tighter and tighter until his knuckles turned white. His footsteps grew deliberately silent and careful. Percy almost missed the small hooded figure sat down in a little alcove, a gap in the black stone. He came to a grinding halt, Maya walking straight into his shoulder, knocking him forwards into a stumble. He steadied himself warily. That was a person, right? Not a monster, an actual person, an Impausa in disguise. Did the mist even work down in Tartarus? "Hey," he called, taking a few steps in the direction of where they were perched, wincing at how loud his voice sounded in the echoing chasm. The figure visibly straightened, twitching their head round. He couldn't see anything beneath the dark hood, and the cloak covered the rest of their body. Percy rolled his wrists, spinning his swords to try and loosen the stiff joints. This screamed trap. He could be ambushed there. It was a prime location, and if he had to choose anywhere to do it, it would be right there. If they came down the sides, cut him off from every direction, it would be a bloodbath. For everyone but him, that was. "If this is an ambush, I swear to you now, I'll kill each and every one of you," Percy warned, eyes flicking from side to side before adding for a healthy dose of intimidation, "as slowly as I can." He was sick and tired of monsters, and he wanted them to know it. His control over blood had improved more and more with each use, becoming more than just a party trick before he could stab them. In a landscape of chaos and death, it felt good to at least have control over one thing. The rush it gave him was no bad thing either. Percy narrowed his eyes. The cloaked figure hadn't moved. He was about to speak again, still flicking his eyes in every direction, when they suddenly gave out a wailing sob, loud and piercing. Percy flinched at the sudden noise. "Shut up," he hissed, striding over Maya, close behind. He stood behind whoever it was, their head bowed low as they cried, and Percy's eyebrows knotted into a scowl. "Stop it, do you want to attract more monsters? 'Cause that's what you're gonna do," Percy snapped desperately, poking the tip of his sword into their back. They stopped crying. He saw them tense up. "Just who might you be?" a low voice whispered out from under the hood. Percy wasn't about to be caught off guard again. "You first." Percy dug the tip of his sword in a bit. "Oh, woe is me," they cried out suddenly. Percy blinked in surprise. "I am Ackley's goddess of misery, depression, all of those sad, sad things that just make me so sad." She burst into tears, burying her head in her knees, the black cloth around her rippling like a curtain. Percy was stumped, a goddess, and an overly emotional one at that. What exactly was he supposed to do here? Percy had no idea what to say. "That's great," he offered awkwardly. He let his sword down a little bit, no longer digging in, and giving a slight cough began to back off. "Weirdo. Yeah, so enjoy that, I'm just gonna." "Wait," Ackley's cried, grabbing the torn edges of his trouser leg. Percy snatched her hand away from him, gripping her wrist tightly. While he wasn't sure if she was a threat, she certainly wasn't going to touch him. He'd had enough of monsters trying to go near him, and sudden contact just made his skin crawl at this point, remembering how they had swarmed him. "What is it?" Percy said levelly. "Please, please, take me with you," she cried. "I can't be out alone here anymore, it's so scary, please, please." Huge, ugly sobs racked her body, and the grip he had on her wrist loosened and tightened irregularly as he thought. Percy furrowed his brow. "The monsters down here will get me, please protect me, I know a place we can go." She pointed madly at the structure Percy had seen. "Not too far from here there's an empty temple, it's safe, no monsters can enter, but I can't get there on my own." Percy scratched his nose. She looked and seemed harmless. What could a goddess of misery make him do? Cry himself to death? If they were ambushed, she might be useful, in the very least. He could just leave her behind while they escaped. And he reasoned in his head she was someone to talk to as well, and Percy couldn't deny that he missed talking to someone, if only Bob was here. "Why should I?" he tested her. "You're a demigod," she said. "I'm a goddess, we're family. Demigods are meant to help people, they're always kind to those who need help." While Percy did feel a lingering sense of duty to help her, he didn't trust her as far as he could throw her, and stood there for several long seconds while thinking. We're going that way anyway, Percy said eventually, not wanting to be out in the open any longer. It's close and it's shelter. I can't say I'll protect you, but you can come with us. I won't hurt you. Yes, absolutely, that's fair, she nodded vigorously. Thank you, thank you. Percy nodded, helping her up at arm's length, his sword still very visibly on display. No problem, he smiled, trying to cheer her up a little. The goddess of misery couldn't be sad all the time, right? At least she'd stop crying, now just waiting in front of Percy expectantly. He didn't know whether to give her a weapon or not. She didn't seem too bad, and he felt a little guilty about leaving her defenseless. In the end, his common sense won out and he didn't give her anything. Maybe he was just being paranoid, he thought. He needed to let go a little. Not everyone down here was bad, just the large majority. Let's go, Percy said gently to her. Chapter 16. Annabeth, I. Wake up, Annabeth yelled at the top of her lungs. The Athena cabin filled quickly with swearing and groans, kids either slamming their heads into the tops of their bunks or onto where pillows had been taped onto the underside in preparation for moments like this. Annabeth gave it no notice as she pulled an unwilling Malcolm out of bed by his ankles. For such a bunch of smart people, you're all idiots. We've slept in, not one of you set an alarm, she shouted. A chorus of "I thought you were setting one" erupted as sibling turned on sibling accusingly, gray eyes narrowing at gray eyes. Why didn't you set one? Came an accusing voice from a top bunk towards Annabeth, her mind ground to a halt. That's not the point and we're wasting time, Annabeth replied smoothly. Get ready, we leave in 10. Annabeth had slept in her clothes, not sparing a single thought to if they were crumpled or not. Her bed was too comfy and familiar for her to care anyway. Though she'd packed her bag the night before, she found herself adding things at the last minute, all her just in cases. She flung in an extra knife, deciding to throw in her entire ambrosia supply and all the nectar in the biggest water bottle she had. She was about to rejoin the fight against Mother Earth herself. She had a feeling that being healed would be more important in this fight than any fight she might have afterwards. Annabeth's hand hovered for a second over her cork pinboard. Pinned right at the top above all her rosettes and notices was one of her favorite pictures. It was her and Percy sat on the wooden jetty at camp, legs swinging, bright grins on their faces. They were about 14 in the photo, pre-war, pre-Hera, pre-whatever the Hades was even going on now, just around when Percy began to catch her up in height. Gods, she thought with a shake of her head, she had loved being taller than him then, but now she couldn't imagine feeling safer than when he had his arms around her, his chin resting on her head. Her 5'9" to his 6 foot something was the perfect ratio. A resolute nod later, she had unpinned it from the wall and chucked it in her bag. She pulled on her boots and, in her haste, triple knotted one and only single knotted the other, and had to redo them. Then she swung her backpack on and stepped out, leaving the cabin in their own personal Athena brand of organized chaos. Annabeth observed the bustling camp as she strode through. In the forest, Hermes' kids were handing out swords like sweets, the green of the trees reflecting off blades polished to perfection. Aphrodites were setting everyone's armor just right, nattering to each other as they concealed knives and lipsticks alike in hidden pockets. On the beach, Ares' kids just seemed to be yelling. She heard more than a couple Braveheart speeches as she went past. Their Scottish accents were just terrible. She accepted her armor with a quick thanks and put it on with self-taught expertise. It helped to calm her mind to do all the clasps and buckles just right. After a brief beat, she asked for Percy's armor as well that had been taken off the boat to be polished. He'd need it when he got back. She still cursed when she remembered how he hadn't been wearing it when he'd fallen. Tucking it under her arm, she headed down to the shore. All of both Vulcan and Hephaestus kids had been pulling all-nighters for several days. And it showed. The shore was absolutely littered with boats and flying machines. There was a long boat pulled up high on the sand, a vivid skull and crossbones painted on the flag fluttering at the top. Next to it floated a kind of wooden speedboat, full to the windows with what seemed like every pillow in camp. She saw more than enough flags with crude slogans scribbled onto the back of orange camp shirts, stuff like Gaia sucks, or Demigods for the win, and even a couple Bring Home Jackson squad. Naturally, the majority were crossed out and spelt wrong, but it was the thought that counted. She noticed that most of the Romans had opted to build flying machines or simply deigned to ride a Pegasus or a chariot, still averse to sailing on the water. And right in the middle of the impromptu fleet, the Argo II stood proudly, smoking and gleaming in various places. A brunette head bobbed about on the deck. Pipes, Annabeth shouted upwards, planting her feet in the hot sand. Piper stuck her head over the edge and waved her over with a free hand. Up here, she called, come on up. Her other hand held a basket that glinted in the sun, filled with what Annabeth assumed to be swords. Annabeth walked over, admiring the ships as she passed. She was always amazed at how during moments like these, everybody's creativity seemed to come out. Everyone gave her distinct looks as she went by. They'd clearly been gossiping about Percy, and the looks varied between respect and pity. A strong girl in a hijab had a wrench in hand and was tightening some bolts on the mast of a very luxurious-looking ship. Annabeth smiled at her and the girl saluted her, oil smeared across her face. Rachel was at the base of the Argo II chatting with Nico. An unlikely pairing, they seemed to get along well. Annabeth had half expected Nico to have disappeared by now. While he hadn't made any moves to leave, he had never really given her the impression he was comfortable on the Argo II. Maybe this time he'd stay in camp for good, even if he wore a black skull shirt instead of an orange camp shirt. The closer she got, the more she could hear. Rachel was talking about art. "Would come find me sometime, I have the perfect canvas for you, ready to go whenever you like," she was saying excitedly. "Maybe yeah," Nico said awkwardly, nodding. He glanced at her, and Annabeth was vaguely amused to see a flash of panic in his eyes. "Annabeth," Nico said a little in relief, "we're ready to go as soon as you are." "I'm ready," Annabeth said quickly. "Rachel, are you coming?" "Me?" she asked before shaking her head emphatically. No, I'm awful with a sword, a hairbrush or a paintbrush maybe, but swords nope. She trailed off a little sadly, but after there was no visible reaction from Annabeth or herself, she continued in a stronger voice. "He tried to teach me once, I almost stabbed myself in the foot," she chuckled. "Then you'd better stay, hold down the fort and keep this place safe," said Annabeth shortly, nodding once. Rachel gave her a soft smile and pulled Annabeth down into a hug. Her small hands patted her on the back and Annabeth took a deep breath to try and relax, the smell of Rachel's wild red hair in her nose, the smell of oil paint and designer perfume. "You're going to find him," Rachel whispered in her ear, "and you're gonna save the world, I'm insisting." Annabeth snorted, but a small warm feeling in her heart blossomed slightly. Where before it had just been painfully hollow, she gave her friend a grateful squeeze before drawing back up to her normal height. She turned to Nico. "Let's go." They both waved their goodbyes to the few demigods staying, and to Chiron behind them, who she had never seen look so uncertain before. His hooves clopped around on the sand below him, not staying still. It made her stomach get a bad, twisty feeling to see him that way. He was clearly affected by the loss of Percy and the knowledge that he was sending the majority of his campers to, well, it wasn't certain death, Percy. Annabeth distracted herself by waving once more, before walking up to the deck to overlook the rest. It looked like everyone was boarding now, some strapping in, some at the helm, a couple holding oars above their heads and making ape noises. The few ships Camp Jupiter had were uniform and neat, no more than 3 or 4 to a boat. As she watched, she saw what looked like the last of her siblings stumbling out the forest to grab their armor and find their respective vessels. Good, that would be everyone. "All right," she yelled, an almost instant silence falling. "Is everyone here?" She waited a few beats as they all looked around. "Yes," called out Travis Stoll. "Then let's go!" Cheers erupted and boats pushed off, flying machines taking to the sky. She spotted Reyna patrolling around on her Pegasus Scipio, dismissing her own boats. Annabeth felt a lurch as the Argo moved, before cruising smoothly away from camp. "We're coming, Percy," Annabeth whispered. "We're coming for you." It was several days later when things changed. They'd just eaten dinner and Annabeth liked to head out onto the deck after. She liked to breathe in the sea air, resting her hands on the rail and just letting her head hang. She'd form plans in her head for scenarios in her wildest dreams. Plans for if she went after Percy down to Tartarus herself. Plans for what should happen if Gaia rose before Percy got out sticks. She even had a plan for if Percy was to suddenly burst out of the floor. She'd rant to herself about the gods. And if tears sometimes mixed with sea spray, only the fish would know. Watching the waves clap together, she heard a shuffle behind her and whipped round, fist raised. "Sorry," Frank winced. "Didn't mean to interrupt, but we're having a meeting downstairs. Reyna's just landed. She says she wants to talk with us." "I'm coming," Annabeth said, tearing her eyes away from the calm sea. She followed him into the meeting room where everyone was already gathered, sitting down in the head chair without preamble. "What is it?" she said straight away, and Reyna leaned forwards to speak from the opposite, cape sweeping along the floor, but was cut off. "Basically, we united the camps, brought back the Parthenos, yada yada yada, but where are the gods and why aren't they here?" Leo asked. "They're probably taking time to recover," Annabeth guessed as Reyna shot Leo a venomous look, causing the son of Hephaestus to flush, apologizing quickly to the praetor, who accepted it with a stiff nod. In truth, Annabeth didn't know where the gods were, and she didn't particularly care. The gods had rarely cared about them before, so what if they needed help? So what if Percy's life depended on them? Or the world. Hera had started this selfish bovine goddess that she was. Why should she do anything to help how it ends? If Percy and Jason were her champions, surely she'd want to. Oh, Annabeth didn't know, keep them alive. They were all too self-absorbed, unreliable, self-distancing. Annabeth, Hazel questioned from next to her. She blinked a few times before looking up. A sharp pain was throbbing in her hand, which she unclenched stiffly, frowning at the crescent-shaped indents on her palm. Hazel placed her hand over the marks. "We're on our way, he knows we're coming for him, it's gonna be okay, you'll see," she said quietly, so only the two of them could hear it, though Annabeth spied Nico covertly listening in from his place leaning up against the wall. "I'm fine, Hazel, don't worry about me, I know," Annabeth began. "Annabeth," Piper cried suddenly, drawing her dagger from where it was sheathed. "Behind you." Annabeth turned around quickly just in time to see a tail slither over the outside of the small, porthole window in the wall. "How many?" Annabeth asked, annoyed. They'd barely been on the sea a few days and already they were being attacked. "I saw about 6 or 7, maybe more, there were quite a few." Frank stood up, twirling his spear. "We can deal with that with just a few of us," Jason said firmly. "It'll be good practice, you three stay down here, we'll be back in a minute." He beckoned to Hazel and Frank. Nico peeled himself off the wall as well to join them. Jason smiled at him in surprise, crinkling his little stapler lip scar. They all turned and prepared to charge up the stairs when Annabeth had a thought. "Jason, wait," she lifted her eyes to meet his lightning blue ones. He turned round. "If there are any that can speak," she said, uncertain of how to phrase it, "just don't kill them, bring one down here," she finished. Jason gave her a strangled look. "Annabeth." "Just do it please," she said. He nodded quietly, grabbing a section of rope that hung off the wall and checked the others over before they went up. Reyna came to sit by her. They didn't speak for several minutes, both wanting to join but both knowing how too many fighters would cause too much getting muddled up. The clashing of weapons above filled the silence. Leo began to fiddle with what looked like nuts and bolts in the corner. "It's supposed to be a practically infinite place, they may not have seen him at all," Reyna said quietly, knowing where Annabeth was planning. "Then I'll know at least that," Annabeth answered shortly, but grateful that at least someone else thought the same as her. They didn't speak again, but Reyna made eye contact with her several times, and each time Annabeth felt slightly more worried. A clatter at the stairs drew everyone's attention. Leo ducked in and jerked back out. "We got a live one," he grinned with a terrible Australian accent. Claws outstretched, it lunged for them. Annabeth didn't move. She didn't have to. She could see the rope around its neck and knew that it still wouldn't stand a chance even if the rope snapped. "Careful," shouted Hazel at Jason. "Its arms have come undone." She wove in front of it as Frank and Jason struggled to keep it back. Batting away its arms with ease, she eventually found a loop and hooked its arms in place. "There you go," she said proudly. Annabeth touched her on the shoulder to convey her gratitude, but her eyes didn't leave the writhing monster. "You're all dead," the monster chanted. "I'll kill you all dead, 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 dead." Piper smacked it on the head to shut it up. As Jason attached the other side of the rope to the cabin wall, Annabeth took her dagger in hand, ready to go, despite the wide eyes of several of the others, but a hand on her wrist stopped her. "No," said Piper, "let me. I need to." Annabeth started. "No, you don't. Sit down, relax, it will talk, but I can make it talk a lot more easily. Charm speak, remember, sit." Piper hushed her, guiding her over to a chair. Annabeth sunk into it, a little annoyed and more than a little impatient. "Fine, fine, just hurry, please," she ground out through her teeth, leaning on her elbows and glaring at the monster. Piper stepped up in front of it, Jason instantly behind her with his sword hovering at its neck as a very clear warning. "You're going to calm down and answer me truthfully," she started. "Have you been to Tartarus recently?" Piper asked, but the rolling warmth of her charm speak couldn't hide the sudden drop in temperature at the name. The monster stopped fighting immediately, going slack in its tight bonds, its eyes glazing over. Leo whistled, and Annabeth had to truly appreciate Piper's powers for just a second. They'd be nowhere without her. Annabeth envied her gift, not for the first time. "Yeah," the monster chatted normally, as if it didn't just try to eat them. "I only got out a couple of days ago." "How many days ago?" Piper pressed for specifics. "2. It could have seen him, the thought crossed everybody's minds and they exchanged looks. "Did you come across any demigods down there?" Piper asked. The room held their breath. Annabeth leaned forwards. The monster opened its teeth-filled mouth. "No," it confessed. "Damn it," Leo slapped the side of the boat angrily and everyone slumped, Annabeth rubbing her temples. "What else does it know?" Reyna asked wearily. "We're not done yet," Annabeth said. "A few more questions, Pipes." "Course," Piper nodded gently. "Ask it if anything it knows has mentioned a demigod." Piper repeated the question and blinked in surprise when the monster replied affirmatively. "Yeah," it answered, and the tension rose again instantly. "Okay, did this demigod have a name?" Piper asked, clasping and reclasping her hands. "I heard them call him Jackson." Everyone snapped to attention, a mess of conversations and questions breaking out immediately. Annabeth stood up and elbowed her way right in front of them to face the monster. "Is he alive?" she asked directly. "The monster or the demi?" "The demigod," Annabeth yelled. "Is the demigod alive?" "As far as I know, yes," the monster said, growing suspicious as he seemed to be realizing the charmspeak was wearing off as Piper was no longer asking the questions. "Is he armed?" Piper asked, ducking to stand next to Annabeth. "Yes." "Is he injured?" "Not that I heard." Annabeth felt a desperation for answers she'd never know rise up in her, and she clenched her hands again. "He's healed up then somehow," Piper guessed, a little puzzled before carrying on. "Is he close to the doors?" "No, I heard he was pretty far away." The monster spoke so conversationally under Piper's influence it was quite bizarre. Piper furrowed her brows. She turned to the room. "Any more questions?" She directed it especially to Annabeth, who was glaring heavily at the monster. 1,000 ran through her head. She placed them in order of necessity, then personal desires, then alphabetical for the sheer sake of it. What was he wearing? What was he using to fight? Was he scared? Each question wanted to jump out of her mouth, but she crammed it down. She couldn't lose herself obsessing over things she couldn't change. It wasn't healthy for her, she knew this. Annabeth bit her lip, shook her head, and walked out the room. "Thanks for your time," she heard Piper say sarcastically, seeing Piper pulling Catoptris out in the corner of her eye and rearing her arm back. The door closed behind her. A few moments later there was gold dust on the floor, reassurance about Percy in their minds, and the noise of a piercing scream from outside. Chapter 17. Percy XI. "We need to break," Percy said flatly to Acles, his voice dragging in exhaustion. "But we're so close," Acles protested. Percy didn't like the tone of frustration he heard in the goddess' voice. She would do it at his pace or she wouldn't do anything at all. It was her fault they'd been walking for so long anyway. And with Damason strapped to Maya's back, she couldn't fetch food for any of them, and Percy's stomach growls had made him paranoid more than once. He was tired, he was starving, and he was losing his patience with just about everyone, including himself. Not too far, she had told him. Just a little bit further. Yeah, right, the temple thing had been further away than any of them had thought. He knew for sure that there were holes in his shoes appearing. "I don't care, Damason might wake up," Percy said, halting Maya, "and I need a miracle like that right about now," he muttered. He administered the Phlegthon water on the barely visible injury, splashing it over and focusing the water through Damason's body. His knowledge of the inner workings of both human and monster bodies by now was more thorough than he had ever thought it would be, but he still wasn't sure why Damason wasn't waking up. He guessed the poison remained, else he probably would have woken up by now if it was only the stab wound that needed healing. He tried to control the poison and remove it, but it was difficult to weave through Damason's body without poisoning more of him, like a delicate game of operation. Percy didn't want to find out what would happen if he touched the sides. He doubted he'd hear a buzzer, so he stuck with the water. Percy tried to do it every few hours or so, but he had no way to know if it was regular. The last administration could have been a week ago, or 5 minutes ago. He didn't have a clue. When Damason stopped moaning in his sleep at the burning, Percy fixed the bonds keeping him in place and stepped back, taking several long and deep breaths. He'd need to keep some of that water for Maya as well. The sticks had effectively taken care of him in regards to breathing the air in, though as he cast his mind back, he hadn't needed the water as often the longer he had spent down here. He hated to think he was adapting, but he preferred it over feeling like someone was shredding him from the inside out. "And now we go," Ackley said behind him. Percy scowled. It was like a kid going, "Are we there yet?" in the back seat. "No," said shortly, "I need to rest or I won't be able to fight." "If we get to the temple quickly you won't need to fight, and you could rest there," Achilles said, and though she had her hood up, he felt as if she was staring him down. No, Percy said again, trying to stop his voice from snapping at her. I don't know what's in there, I can't risk getting caught off guard, I need rest, Percy explained with a hard look on his face. Achilles dropped her side of the argument almost instantly. Of course, I will keep watch. Achilles shuffled over to a stone and slumped down, a mournful sigh floating out from under her hood. Percy frowned uncertainly. Maya was sighing deeply, the Draken snoozing next to him. She had a lot to carry, she needed sleep too, but this meant she couldn't watch out while he slept. If he was to do this to trust Achilles to watch over him, he'd need to go all in. He couldn't sleep with one eye open again, he'd end up not getting enough sleep overall. He tallied up his odds in his head. Achilles was minor goddess, she couldn't really do him damage, could she? He had almost forgotten about the curse on him, he still felt the same amount of vulnerability. Despite spending about a year with the Achilles curse on him, he had forgotten how much he obsessed over his mortal point, even when he couldn't remember where it was. Still, the urge to sleep was pressing down on his eyes like cotton wool had replaced his brain and was expanding inside his head. He needed to stop being so paranoid. Percy nodded slowly. Okay, he murmured, you take watch, wake me if you see anything. His knees buckled at that point and he crashed to the floor. He crawled with weak arms to lean against Maya, who subconsciously wrapped her tail around his torso in her sleep. He breathed in. The dense air of Tartarus never ceased in being so suffocatingly hot, and he could feel each bead of sweat that ran down his sides. Yet he still leaned into the Draken, whose leathery hide would have probably scalded him had it not been for the curse, happy to just have contact with someone. He breathed out. He woke up a while later, a little disoriented as his eyes snapped open, and quickly ran his hands along his body. He didn't seem to be injured, he had all his stuff on him, nothing seemed amiss. He checked over Maya and Damason, the former waking up as he did so, staring up at him with sea-green eyes. Standing back up after patting Maya on the head softly, he walked over to Achilles. Guess he could trust her after all, even if it was only just a little bit. She still had her cloak over her, obscuring her face. So what's with the cloak? He asked out of sheer curiosity, unable to stop himself. She jumped a mile into the air, clearly not hearing him get up. Percy twitched. What? Achilles babbled. The cloak, the cloak, it's to cover me because if you look under the cloak you get very depressed, Achilles stammered out. Percy scratched the back of his neck, he knew he didn't scare her that badly. Okay, he said, shrugging deliberately. She was definitely hiding something. What exactly he didn't know, she was using the cloak to cover something. Maybe she had a face only her mother could love, maybe she had an extra eye, maybe she kept a snake under it. Hey, he didn't know, but he kept her at a distance as they started moving again. The shaky trust he had with her got a little bit shakier. The temple in the distance was rapidly getting bigger. Percy started to try and make a plan. He had only gotten as far as leaving Maya, Achilles and Damason outside and going in guns blazing, then somehow making it safe for them. Or swords blazing, he corrected. It sounded like a pretty good plan to him. He could handle anyone inside. What were they gonna do, stab him? As they got closer, Percy started chewing his lip. He swung his bronze sword back and forth, holding on tightly. The temple-type thing was a lot bigger than he thought. And a lot more terrifying. It was bigger than the big house at camp, like a mansion almost, definitely no longer a temple as he had first thought. Worshipping anything in there would be wrong. The roof spiked high and was so dark that it was barely noticeable. It was at least 3 stories high and had windows along the walls, and despite being in the poor light of Tartarus, Percy had a feeling that he wouldn't be able to see through them even if he was in the bright sunlight from the surface. They were pitch-black windows that seemed to flicker as he squinted. The high doors at the front were shut, and though it was dark in Tartarus, it seemed almost unnaturally dark in and around the general area. It was as if light bent around the mansion, too scared to go near it. No monsters either, Percy thought with a frown. In hindsight, he hadn't seen a single monster on the way there. The air felt dead, like it was hung from the ceiling of the great pit, just dangling there for them to breathe in. Even the glassy black ground had lost the sheen to its crystalline rocks. Percy's brows furrowed as he took the whole place in. Something was wrong, he knew something was wrong, could feel it. It all looked too civilized to be down here. An ostentatious mansion, not a speck of dust in sight, the metal gates practically gleaming as if they had been polished. Someone lived here, not just surviving like the rest of them. No, whoever resided here was living. The thought made Percy's skin crawl. No one should be living down here. Percy drew their group to halt. No one was going any nearer until he figured out what it was. As much as he wanted to turn tail and head back, he knew there was nothing back in that direction for them, and any more walking could very possibly kill him. He couldn't take being lost anymore. He hated their lack of direction, aimlessness that he knew was doing nothing to help his friends on the surface. And hey, who knew? Maybe if someone nice lived here he could ask for directions. The thought almost made him laugh, almost. He debated tying up Maya but decided that she should be able to run and take Damieson away should things go wrong. He turned to Achilles. Upon second thought, he'd rather have her as backup than leave her unsupervised with the other two. "We'll clear it out and come back for them," he said. "I don't want them in there, come on." He drew his sword and edged forwards. Going through the door seemed like a plan. Should he knock? He was torn between the element of surprise and just being polite. He could smash a window and break in, but he highly doubted that was going to get him in the good books of whoever lived there if they were home. No one would help him if he just suddenly crashed head first through their window and sprawled right in the middle of their front room, asking if he was going the right way. Percy's lips twitched. Movement behind him. "Wait." The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He ducked. "What are you doing?" he hissed at Achilles, sword at her throat in less than a second. She had swung at him. She was facing him, hood still irritatingly obscuring her face, but it didn't detract from the large rock in her hand, ready to bludgeon him in the back of the head. He had barely had enough time to react. "Enough is enough," Achilles snapped, what he presumed to be her chin up high above his sword. "I have done my part." Percy had a sinking feeling in his stomach, but the lower it sank, the more it twisted into anger. What had he been thinking? He shouldn't have given her even the bare minimum of trust. He should have ditched her, wounded her, incapacitated her. They hadn't got this far to be taken down by some pathetic minor goddess. He had bigger fish to fry. "Whatever you think you're planning to do, I promise you I will double it on you." Percy's eyes burned into her, stepping around slowly so he had both Achilles and the mansion thing in the same field of vision. "I won't be doing anything," Achilles said with a slight quaver in her voice, a voice that had significantly changed in the last few seconds from low and miserable to cold and cruel. It all happened in a split second. Achilles jerked her head back, away from his sword, turning to scream at the house behind her. "My lady the demigod." His sword was embedded in her back in a heartbeat, thrown with such force that it knocked the goddess down to her knees with a cry. He could see it protruding from the front of her cloak. She howled in pain again, and he called it back into his hand, this time catching it. The sword dripped with ichor. "My lady." A bang like a gunshot made him flinch, his heart pounding out beats like a samba in his chest. His breathing grew faster. The doors of the mansion had been thrown open with such force that they had bounced off the wall. A winged figure emerged, seemingly growing bigger with every step, until she towered above even the mansion, at least 40 feet tall, dark dress trailing across the ground smoothly. Percy took a few steps backwards hastily, as he felt the sheer power oozing off of the figure. The woman was a churning figure of ash and smoke, as big as the Athena Parthenos statue but very much alive. Her dress was void black, mixed with the colors of a space nebula as if galaxies were being born in her bodice. Her face was hard to see except for the pinpoints of her eyes, which shone like quasars, her shadowy skin occasionally solidifying to a beautiful, almost black brown. When her huge black wings behind her beat, waves of darkness rolled over the cliffs. Percy had to crane his neck up just to see her, blinking in awe. Achilles stumbled forwards, not necessarily wanting to get any closer either. She lifted pale hands to her cloak, throwing down the hood. Percy narrowed his eyes, his attention shifting. She did not look like how he had pictured. One side of Achilles' face was curved up into a bright smile, the other half a sinister picture of bared teeth, razor-sharp. Comedy and tragedy masks merged in the goddess skin. Both sides moved when Achilles began to babble. "My lady Nyx, mother, I bring you a demigod. The demigod who got trapped in the pit with skin of iron, mother, he has the blessing of the Styx. Nyx, the primordial, the protogen, goddess of the night, sister of Tartarus and Gaia." Percy closed his eyes. He was tempted to turn the air blue with swearing, but found his wide vocabulary of curses did not quite cover his situation. "Silence, Apate," Nyx hushed with a smoothly powerful voice. "Let the boy say his last words before he dies." Percy felt his hands tremble a little and clenched his weapons tighter. He opened his eyes and glared. "Apate," his voice shook with anger, and he directed it all at the minor goddess in front of him, somehow trying to ignore that primordial watching him. "Achilles, no," Apate smirked, despite the wound going through her, and the way her hands shook as she pressed hard to stop the bleeding. "Of course I'm not Achilles, that whining mess isn't this clever," she boasted. I am Apate, goddess of deceit. That, however, must be obvious to you now, Apate crowed infuriatingly. Percy thought of Maya and Damason tucked behind a rock barely a few meters away. They'd never make it out of here alive without him. You're an idiot, Percy snapped. Yeah, sure, you lured me here because you knew I wanted shelter and you did it all under a fake name, but you know that you could have just used your real name, right? Percy gestured angrily. Nobody, and I mean nobody, has ever heard of Apate. I hadn't even heard of Acles. Your deceit wasn't all that awe-inspiring. I've met better liars than you in New York alone. Apate flushed with rage, but Nyx observed him. She stepped forwards and began to shrink. Percy paled but stood his ground until the primordial only stood at around 6 feet tall, matching his height. You claim to know those better at deceit than the goddess of deceit? Who would be a better candidate? Nyx asked him directly, and Percy tried not to let the emptiness in her eyes knock his knees together. Percy swallowed. I would, he lifted his chin with fake arrogance. I am more deceitful than this worthless goddess. Apate spluttered as Percy continued, hopping beyond hope that he could lie his way through the whole situation. This giant, Percy gestured behind him, praying that Damason was still unconscious. I tricked him. I acted like his friend, persuaded him to accompany me across Tartarus, Percy lied. He was stung by Campe, a useful distraction which gave me time to kill her. He tamed the Draken here, which I use at my disposal to carry whatever I please. Bodyguards for hire, only I don't pay a single drachma. He hated the words that tumbled out of his mouth but couldn't stop, knowing that just stabbing some things wasn't going to get him out alive. He needed to trick her, and more importantly, he needed to keep talking. Longer he talked, longer he stayed alive. It had worked well for him in his life up until now, so he continued. I was previously accompanied by a Titan as well, Apetus, Percy said, finding it easier to use the Titan's real name over his given name. Although after a dip in the lethe courtesy of me, he didn't know that. He only knew what I told him. He was nothing but a puppet for me, killed by Campe, but I got his worth out of him while I had him, manipulating him to kill his brother Hyperion. I have barely a scratch on me because of my deceit. Can Apate say the same? He deliberately and visibly eyed her seeping wound. All parlor tricks, mumbled Apate before Percy cut her off as sudden inspiration hit. The final deceitful act that puts me above you. I tricked you, Apate. Percy lied through his teeth, keeping a knowing smile on his face until it was beginning to hurt. I lied just now. I lied when I first met you. I knew who you really were. I knew where you were taking me to who you were taking me. Monsters didn't attack us because they knew your plan, yes. I got a free pass to this place, and the greatest honor of all, I get to meet the Lady Nyx. Percy finished, feeling slightly sick at himself. Nyx regarded him with an indecipherable expression. Then perhaps you should be the new god of deceit, she said. If my children fail to serve me correctly, maybe their spirit should move on and find a more convincing host. Percy struggled to not raise his eyebrows. But Apate switched her targets, choosing to growl at Percy instead. He is lying to us. He did all that with good intentions. I know trickery when I see it. You cannot fool me. Percy cursed like a sailor in his head. He hated Apate with a passion. If he died here, if he didn't make it back to his family, she would pay. Then was that not the biggest deceit of all? Percy threw caution to the wind and hated how desperate it came out. But perhaps was all Nyx said. Although I have to respectfully decline the offer of godhood, my Lady Nyx, Percy said, bowing his head to hide his darting eyes, as to be anything associated with you would be too much of an honor. But now then, who would be the goddess of deceit? Nyx asked coolly, and Percy hated how much she was just playing with him, nipping her prey in the water before snapping. There are plenty of deceitful people out there. Check the governments first, my lady, Percy tried. But at the end of it all, the only thing I can heavily recommend is that you do not need to burden yourself with such a pitiful goddess as Apate. He growled in the direction of the minor goddess. Percy had no idea what he was aiming for. All he knew was that he wanted Apate to pay and that he wanted to get out ASAP. Then kill her, Nyx replied calmly. Percy blanked. Apate gasped, Mother. Sorry, Percy asked, finding himself at a complete loss. I shall find a replacement. You will dispose of her. Nyx's eyes glittered hungrily. If you are so powerful and she is not, get rid of her. If you cannot, then who do I really have no need for? Percy's eyes flickered to Apate, who was practically quivering in indignant fury. She wanted him to kill Apate. To kill a goddess. He knew gods and goddesses could die, that they could fade if humanity forgot about them enough. He had been there when Pan had died, but could they be killed? Could he kill a goddess? He glanced at Nyx and he knew in an instant that she didn't think he could do it. He knew that she will kill him if he didn't do it. She was just waiting to kill him. Surely she wouldn't have such a disregard for her own children. But Percy had seen the gods with their children up close and unfortunately personal. He knew they would kill them in a second. Her spirit would move on. He guessed that's how it worked with minor gods and goddesses. No one really worshipped the minor ones anymore. Maybe their spirit just flitted from one body to another. So what if he just killed the host's body? Turned to face Apate, his heart pounding out of his chest. Could he kill this current body? He'd killed a lot of monsters over the years. When he was 12, he thought he'd never be able to kill a titan. When he grew older, he never thought he'd be able to kill a giant. Now as he stood with the phantom blood of both titans and giants alike soaking his hands, Percy thought hard. Maybe this was just the next level up for him. He felt stronger than ever with the curse of Achilles on him. It wasn't as if he didn't want to kill her. And it wasn't like anybody would stop him. Ichor was like blood, wasn't it? Apate must have seen his face settle on a resolution, must have seen his eyes turn onto her with an expression he himself didn't know how to describe, for she charged at him, throwing herself off the floor, her wound irrelevant to her and her hands crackling with sparks. Percy ducked as she lunged, slashing at her torso, cutting her deeply. Apate howled, trying to rip at his face. "You've ruined everything, I'll kill you," she screamed. "Then you're giant, then you're draken." Her hands glanced off of him, nothing more than an annoyance, and with every failed swipe. The noise of broken glass crunching echoed in Percy's head, stamping down the final internal wall stopping him from doing this. Ichor made an immortal strong. What if he took it away? "I'll find that titan too, Apetus, I'll trick him into fighting with us instead. Gaia was right, you will lose everything," she taunted, trying to grab his head and throw him, but Percy just grabbed her wrists in one hand. Percy angrily flipped her over his shoulder, her breath audibly knocked out of her, and dared a look at Nyx. She was just stood there, watching, making no visible move to intervene. Percy went back to his fight, eyes darting to the gold seeping through Apate's cloak from one growing stain to another. An idea formed in his head. He raised his hand and began to pull the ichor out of Apate's wounds. Her face paled, even the cheerful smile vanishing, but as he increased the pressure throughout her body, he could see her face drop further as she realized he had her pinned down and unable to move. The pool of gold around her got bigger and bigger. She panicked, she began to plead. "I didn't mean it," she cried. "I can give you anything you want, safe transport out of here, riches untold, undiscovered by man and god alike." Her chest moved up and down faster. Percy watched the ichor weave through the glassy floor beneath her. "I'm not lying," she shrieked. "I mean it, for real this time, no tricks, I swear." Her limbs began to shake and convulse. Her wide eyes met his. "You're not lying?" Percy asked, breathing out heavily through his nose, and he gritted his teeth. "Apate, goddess of deceit, isn't lying to me. Tell me, why don't I believe you?" Percy continued, looking her in the eye as lights flickered on and off within them. Ichor was strange, thicker than monster blood, yet thinner at the same time. He felt like it was made of multiple violin strings, each one thrumming with a glow of power, and he could almost hear the pings as he disconnected them, tore them apart. He ripped them off one by one. Apate's movement slowed down, her begging turning into low, indecipherable moans. Soon, he felt that there was only one string left, only one more tie connecting her to the world. It felt fragile in his hands and thinner than a hair. He'd never killed a god before. He briefly wondered if his dad would be angry. If he ever found out. He broke the last golden strand. A blinding light erupted in front of him, causing Percy to instinctively throw his arm over his eyes. He could feel the heat against his skin, a slight burning despite the curse. When he slowly lowered his arm, his gaze was drawn down. Apate's body was surrounded by a large scorch mark seared into the ground. Her skin was white, completely white, drained of all color. Her lifeless eyes gazed into nothing. She looked human. Percy looked away. Maybe he had gone too far. Maybe he should have listened to the voices in his head that sounded suspiciously like Annabeth. But he didn't have time to dwell on it as a clapping came from his right. He slowly turned around. Nyx didn't stop staring at him as she applauded. "A demigod with the power to kill gods," she said with a hunger in her eyes. "What an interesting addition you will make." Chapter 18. Percy XII. "Addition, my lady?" Percy asked hesitantly, adding the title onto the end. She seemed the type who enjoyed flattery and hadn't told him to call her anything different. He made a mental note about it as she smiled in a satisfied way. Yes, she nodded. I can only leave this place at night free to roam most of the earth. During the day I am often left here to amuse myself, so I collect things. Most of my children, once they're created, stay down here and fetch things for me. Food, trinkets, she cast her gaze over him. Demigods, you will stay down here with me now. Kill a couple gods for me here and there, it will be most entertaining. My lady, Percy felt a trickle of panic as he spoke. TT sounds an honor, but... Good, now come, she cut him off regally and swept away. Percy breathed out heavily. My lady, I can't, he said quickly. She turned around. Can't? Pure ice crept up his spine. I can't live down here, he tried to explain. And why not? She asked in a low, dangerous tone. I have places to be. I don't belong down here, Percy stressed. Seems to me like you do, Nyx said, not so subtly, glancing at Apate's lifeless body next to them. Percy opened his mouth in indignation before slamming it shut into a thin frown. She was the one who made him do it in the first place, he thought defensively. She couldn't criticize him for it now. Percy looked at the dead goddess on the floor. His eyes flicked from the metallic pool of gold on the ground to the milky white eyes open but staring into nothing. He had wanted her to pay. He hadn't even known if he could have do it in the first place. It was just like fighting a titan, Percy told himself. Should he feel bad? Should he feel proud? Percy just felt unsure. It's not that, he ended up saying, still trying to explain. Before I had this curse, the air alone was killing me. I really don't belong here. And I have people I need to get back to on the surface, I promised. And if I don't get back, monsters will continue to not die. Gaia will rise and... Gaia, Nyx said, suddenly angry. What does she have to do with this? Percy blinked. She didn't know. He'd presumed they all knew what was going on, chatting about it at some weekly primordial wine tasting. It seemed like a pretty hard thing to miss. She's rising, he said slowly, causing Nyx to screech and start packing, black wings beating harder, rolling waves of darkness flowing over Percy, who shivered before carrying on. She opened the doors of death nearly a year ago and chained them down. Monsters don't die properly anymore. They can come back as soon as they're killed. They reform in seconds. There was another great prophecy, and we thought it would be in a couple centuries, but instead it just decided to come early. It's about 7 demigods. We're trying to stop her. Good, Gaia must not rise, Nyx snapped. She will burn the world, I know her, and if the world burns, what does that leave for the rest of us? Wait. She looked him dead in the eye, and Percy tried not to squirm. You are in this prophecy, she demanded. Yeah, unfortunately, my lady, he tacked on the end. Tell me it. Percy breathed out of his nose. It wasn't that he didn't know it. Oh, he knew it off by heart all right, could hear it in his head when he closed his eyes. 7 half-bloods shall answer the call. To storm or fire the world will fall. An oath to keep. With a final breath, Percy was cut off. Foes bear arms to the doors of death, Nyx finished grimly. Percy blinked. You've heard it, he asked in surprise. Of course, Nyx said. I was there several millennia ago when the Oracle of Delphi delivered it for the first time. There have been countless heroes attempting to fulfill it. Even Hercules and Theseus attempted it to no avail. You say yet another group is trying again, and that you are part of it. Percy nodded with a grimace. The glints in Nyx's eyes darted about as she clearly thought. The shadows above them twisted and Percy glanced up, swearing he saw claws in the darkness, the shine of multiple eyes. He dropped his eyes, trying to ignore it. A child of a prophecy was worshipped in my time, Nyx snapped. How could they let you down here? Is this part of the prophecy? No, Percy said. Well, I don't know. It's complicated. I fell down here so the girl I love wouldn't, so she'd be safe. But now I have to get back. I need to get to the doors of death and get out to finish the prophecy with the others. I appreciate you letting me live, really I do, but I'm sorry I need to leave. For a second, Percy saw her just reaching forwards and tearing his head off. He found himself slightly leaning his head back just in case. Instead, Nyx just watched him closely before answering. You must love her a lot, said Nyx before composing herself. Gaia must not rise. I won't let that happen. If you need to go, I won't keep you here. You will be under my protection. Percy blinked several times more, surprised. Thank you, my lady, he said eventually, feeling like he had dodged a primordial goddess-sized bullet. Gaia has to be stopped, Nyx murmured almost to herself. Are all 7 of you still alive? Percy nodded. I know you're a child of Poseidon or Neptune. I can smell it underneath that curse of yours. The others. Athena, Jupiter, Aphrodite, Mars, Pluto, and Hephaestus. Percy ticked them off on his fingers. A mix of Romans and Greeks, Nyx mused. Gaia must be causing quite some havoc then. She's brought all the giants back as well, Percy said. Nyx glanced at Damason. All but one, she said. The giant here, how long ago was he poisoned? Percy shrugged. I don't know. Wait, can you tell the time down here? Nyx gave him a flash of a serene smile as she walked over to Damason. Can't you? Nyx stood over the giant. Maya didn't bat an eyelid at her, even seemed to relax as the primordial goddess ran a hand covered in twinkling diamond rings along Damason's head, narrowing her eyes. The smoke and ash of her skin darkened and she looked back up at an awkwardly stood Percy. He does not have long left, she said in a very businesslike manner. Percy did a double take. To wake up or to live, he asked, slightly panicked. To awaken, Nyx waved her hand. You may stay here until he wakes. I shall seal off the area. Huge black gates twisted into patterns like molten metal shimmered into view. Towering at around 30 feet, Percy couldn't help but feel slightly trapped. They swung shut with a clang in between two cliffs. A wash of dark gray ran over everything within, then disappeared, sinking into the shadows of the ground when it was done. To get where you need to go, you will need to go through my house, but you must rest first. I am sure your curse demands it, Nyx purred. Rest, my little godkiller. Percy furrowed his brow at the title she gave him. He wasn't a godkiller. He'd killed someone who had put him and his friends in danger. She just happened to have been a goddess. It wouldn't have mattered what she was. But Percy agreed to take a rest break. It wasn't as if he truly had a choice. Helping Damason down from Maya, who looked relieved to no longer have to carry the giant, he laid him out on the floor. There wasn't really another place to put him. He sat with Damason on the edge of a rock, listening to his breathing. Percy kept looking up at the dead goddess a few mere meters away. He wasn't sure what to think about it all, so he just tried not to think about it. Keyword tried. In fact, he was so distracted, he nearly missed Damason's eyes flickering open. Damason, Percy cried, leaning over him. You're awake. I seems I am, Damason agreed wearily, already pushing himself up shakily. Whoa, Percy jumped up to help him into a sitting position, keeping a hand on his shoulder to hold him steady. Damason glanced around. Where are we? He asked. Nyx's house, Percy said sheepishly. Damason's eyes bulged. The Mansion of Night, he said, dumbfounded. She's cool with us staying here, Percy added to reassure him. You talked to her? Damason asked, aghast. Perseus, not even we giants go near this place. How are we? Did she? Hey man, chill, it's okay. I know it seemed all oh snap she's gonna kill us for a little while, but it's totally okay now. We're under her protection. Apparently she wants Gaia to rise just as much as we do, Percy responded, shrugging. Damason shook his head in disbelief. He didn't seem to know what to say. They sat in silence for a few minutes, Damason slowly gaining enough strength to sit up properly, starting to stretch his limbs. Percy jogged his legs up and down where he was sat. You know what? Percy said out of the blue. You know what one of the first things I'm gonna do when we get out is? Damason looked at him, raising his eyebrows. I'm gonna order 10 burgers. No, Percy corrected himself as his stomach growled again. 100 burgers, all with fries, throw in some nuggets and a whole fountain of milkshakes. And I'm going to sit there and eat it all in one single sitting. I don't even care if Gaia is clawing her way out the ground like 3 feet away from me. I'm eating my damn happy meal. Damason didn't move from his vaguely slumped position, but Percy could see him smiling. Like the Draken steaks are okay, don't get me wrong, but knowing they're made of Maya is just a little weird. He knew he was rambling, but just the thought of normal food had been making his stomach claw for attention for weeks. Cupcakes were also on his list, with buttercream, light, sweet, sugary buttercream. Percy's mouth watered. What will you do? He turned to Damason to distract himself. What do you mean? Damason replied. When we get out, Percy clarified, what will you do? Damason seemed to think for a few minutes and Percy waited for him to answer, his eyes wandering through the dark red clouds, searching for shapes, but only seeing pools of blood and tendrils of mist like arms reaching out for salvation. I don't know, the giant said eventually. It's been so long, I don't know what it's like up there anymore. You could come to camp, Percy said, tearing his eyes away to smile. It's run by a centaur called Chiron. I bet you'd be friends, and I'm sure we'll need a few more instructors by the time this is all over. What would I teach? I'm not one for violence. Percy had to agree. Whenever they fought, he could see the toll it took on Damason mentally to have to keep causing harm and creating violence. He just wanted peace and no one would grant him it. Percy knew the feeling. You could teach, Percy trailed off before an idea hit him, you could teach demigods how to tell the fates to stuff it, how prophecies and quests don't dictate their lives, how to make their own destinies like you did. Gods know we need it, and you can tell the gods that too, he muttered under his breath. That sounds good, Damason said with a small wistful smile. He lifted his head, looking at Percy. No, Percy thought as Damason's pupils wandered over his shoulder, looking behind Percy. What's over there? Damason asked, furrowing his brow weakly, probably still in a little leftover pain from Camper's sting. Percy followed his gaze all the way over to Apate's lifeless body. That was the goddess of deceit, Apate, Percy said carefully. Was? Damason asked, surprised. Nyx killed her. No, Percy said uncertainly, I did. Damason looked straight at him. What? He asked, as if he thought he had misheard. She tricked me? Percy found himself a little desperate to explain himself, but relaxed the more he spoke, the more he thought out loud. She led us here trying to kill us. She said she was going to kill you, hunt down Bob. I couldn't let that happen, and Nyx would have killed me if I hadn't done anything, so I killed her. Percy nodded at the end, a little wobbly but firm. He had killed a goddess today, and he was strangely okay with that. It was kill or be killed down here, he told himself. She had deserved it. Now he had a primordial on his side, he reasoned. That was good. Was killing her good? Percy didn't know. He'd thought about killing gods before, Harikoff, he just never thought he'd have the guts to try or the power to actually do it. But now he'd finally done it. Maybe it was just the next level for him, he thought again. He forced himself to look at the body once more before glancing back. Damason kept staring him in the eye. Back in my day, demigods were not so powerful, was all he said at last. They did not have the power to evict an immortal spirit from its host. Does that mean Apate is still alive out there? Percy realized with a cold feeling. Damason shook his head. With minor gods, they will simply be reborn into another host. They will not remember their previous life. As minor gods have less acknowledgement in the mortal world, their ties to hosts and to life are not as strong. They fade easily. To kill an Olympian would be a much harder task, requiring much more power you seem to wield. He eyed him. It's probably just the curse making everything stronger. Percy shook his head dismissively. Damason looked doubtful but didn't elaborate on his thoughts. When do we go? He said instead. Nyx wanted us to rest, for me to wait until you woke up. I haven't slept, but I'm good anyway. I took a power nap before we got here. Either way, once you're good, I think she said we're supposed to go through her house. Damason looked unsure. That house? He hesitated, and Percy understood, not wanting to go into the looming mansion much either. It'll be fine, Percy reassured the giant. We can do it. We haven't come this far to give up now. Damason nodded, but paled as his eyes slid over Percy's shoulder. Excellent, said the smooth voice of Nyx behind him. Then it's time. Chapter 19. Annabeth IV. Annabeth walked out the cabin, her hands running through her blonde hair. It was knotted and dry, exposed to the salty air too much. She pulled it back into a tight ponytail, wanting to at least have control over one thing in her life right now and get her hair out her face. Not for the first time, she felt the urge to just cut it all off. Annabeth stared into the water, tinted dark orange from the sunset over it. Her elbows came up to rest on the metal rail. It was cold. She rubbed a hand over her face. Gods, she was tired. She was tired of all this. She just wanted Percy back right now, wanted him right next to her. She wanted to tell him again that she loved him so much it hurt. She wanted the feeling of his arms round her. The air was getting cooler, causing her skin to prickle, and she pulled back. She sighed. Deciding to do a quick detour, she wandered through the main corridor, ducking into his room. Still perched on his chair, Percy's hoodie was freshly washed, but she could still smell him when she put it on. Annabeth wished for the first time that she could fly like Jason. She could be there already. How far had they come so far? They'd been sailing for too long, and though she'd initially thought that cabin fever didn't affect her, she was feeling an increasing urge to just get away from the stupid boat, entertaining her daydream fantasy of having dinner in a nice little restaurant with sturdy stone slab flooring. With a frown, Annabeth realized dimly that she hadn't eaten anything today. She wouldn't be able to work to her best ability. She turned to go into the kitchen, whip up a quick snack and go to bed. But a sudden impact to the side of the boat knocked her off balance. Annabeth was thrown to the floor. She yelled out involuntarily as her head smacked into the side of the rail, stars bursting behind her eyes, and she scrambled to her knees, unsheathing her dagger. She heard a scream in the distance. Monsters! A boat had crashed into theirs. They'd run ashore. She'd barely had enough time to regain her senses before a shadow fell on the wall in front of her, tall and thick. She whipped around, slashing. Annabeth's eyes widened in horror. She cursed. A large mass was unfurling under the sea, knocking against the boat, dark and writhing. She couldn't identify it beyond angry octopus. Boats of demigods around them were crashing, some kind of tentacles wrapping around them, pulling them into a circle around the monster. The black shape under the water got bigger and bigger as it headed towards the surface, and Annabeth's eyes grew wide as the water churned and frothed. Annabeth, Piper cried behind her, the door bouncing off the wall as it was flung open. Annabeth glanced at her for 1 second to see if she was okay. 1 second, that was all it took. A tentacle shot towards her, closing around her waist like a vice. Her ribs strained under the pressure. Annabeth's hands shot to it, trying to wrench it off of her, find a gap to wriggle out of, but it was too slippery, too tight, too late. The breath in her lungs vanished as she was yanked off her feet. She flew through the air. The monster writhed and hurled her about in its cold, unyielding grip. Her trapped arms strained to use her dagger. She saw Clarice, dripping wet and astride a tentacle, stabbing it repeatedly and violently. People were screaming and leaping into the water, weapons held above their heads. Her body took a turn in the air as the tentacle spasmed, coughing as her ribs felt like they were bending inwards, and suddenly she was looking up at the rapidly shrinking sky, plunging towards the sea. She fell freely into the ocean with a splash, the tentacle releasing her a few feet above the water. She spluttered as she swallowed what felt like half the sea, the salt leaving her taste buds cringing. Her face screwed up. She treaded water unsteadily, the crazy waves caused by the thrashing monster threatening to overwhelm her. Another flailing tentacle shot across the water towards her, and she gripped her wet dagger as tightly as she could. Annabeth! Jason dropped out the sky, his sword plunging into it before it could get to her. It recoiled in an instant, and Annabeth could see the rest of the beast squirm fiercely, sending a whole row of boats knocking into each other. "Take my hand," Jason shouted, hovering above the water, his free arm out. She kicked herself up as far as she could and held her hand up. The son of Jupiter grasped her wrist firmly, ready to lift her back. Annabeth held on. She'd seen him fly with other people before and prayed that he'd be able to lift her up no problem, even though she could feel her sodden, waterlogged clothes weighing her down. Percy's hoodie felt like it was made of concrete. The freezing water caused bumps to raise on her arms. They began to rise. She saw Jason's face change, paling slightly, and craned her neck round. The head of the beast was emerging from the water, one massive red eye in the center of its domed head, its skin a dark gray. It opened its mouth and screeched, revealing rows upon rows of razor-sharp fangs. If Annabeth had her hands free, she would have clapped them over her ears. Instead, she just grimaced and kicked her feet harder. Something curled around her leg, her eyes went wide. Jaso! Like a yo-yo snapping backwards, her head went under. Jason's hand ripped from her grasp. All sound cut off with just the gulp of the water engulfing her, then the dim sound of bubbles streaming out of her nose and ears. Her hair swept onto her face, the velocity sending her arms shooting up towards the surface. Her eyes squeezed shut. She clenched her dagger even harder, determined not to lose it. She tried to pull her leg up but just succeeded in pulling her body down into a crouching position, the tentacle unwilling to let go. The grip around her ankle was reminiscent to Arachne's web, and the irony was not lost on her. She dragged her dagger down through the water, trying to get power behind it, but she could feel how all her movements were so slow. Her lungs began to strain. Rather than stabbing the tentacle, she made saw-like motions across the slimy skin, fumbling as best she could with her eyes closed. It darted away like a startled fish, the grip vanishing. She kicked off immediately, pushing as hard as she could to the surface. She felt a hand grip her forearm, pulling her up faster. She broke the top of the waves with a gasp, inhaling as much blessed oxygen as she could. Jason surfaced beside her. "Are you okay?" he choked, spitting water out of his mouth. Children of Zeus weren't always the best swimmers. Something about the rivalry just stopped it. Annabeth remembered Thalia avoiding swimming a lot as well. She nodded. She hoped her dagger wasn't going to rust from all of this. "We're aiming for the eye," Jason shouted over the din of shouts. Explosions, the screeching of the kraken-like monster. Waves lapped at their chins, both struggling to tread water. They swam over to where a whirlpool was forming. Assaulted on every side, the squid monster span and rolled, lashing out and screeching. They reached the thicker parts of the tentacles, where only the tips were moving, and clambered up onto them, trying to run forwards for the head like the others were doing. Clarice in particular had gone from swiping at sly tentacles to being sat on its head, lying on her front to stab at it. The skin on its head was thick, and Annabeth could see spears glancing off of the natural armor. Out of the corner of her eye, she spotted a shark swimming over to them. "Whoa," Jason shouted, pointing his sword at it. "No," Annabeth said, grabbing his wrist. A second later, a very wet Frank was being hauled up. "Thanks," he spat water out his mouth with a grossed-out expression. "That thing's huge. I got down right to the sea bed and it's as if it's actually like embedded in the ocean floor. I can't see anything that looks like a chest anywhere for its heart to be." Jason cursed mildly, almost politely compared to what Annabeth could hear the Greeks shouting at it. "Then we'll have to just go for the head." A series of bangs shattered over her shoulder, as a line of Roman ships fired in a row. Two missed, but eliciting a twisted scream, the rest connected. At least one ship was on fire, and a haze of smoke began to rise. The flying machines above had long lines of rope dangling from them, some hoisting drenched demigods from the sea, the others sending reinforcements, little black shapes descending along the golden horizon with swords clenched between their teeth. WHA. They were all swept off the tentacle as the monster writhed in pain, creating dangerously high waves. Annabeth kept her chin pointing up, spluttering as another wave washed over her face. In the smoke, she couldn't see anyone and panicked for her friends. "Frank," she cried, "Jaso." Down under again in the inky black of the water, her legs flipped over her head, water getting up her nose and burning. She tried to kick back up to the surface again as being caught off guard had left her with very little oxygen. She reached her arms up. Her hands met wood. Annabeth's face screwed up in panic. "What? Where was she?" "Oh," Annabeth cursed as she realized she was under a boat. That wasn't not good, not at all, quite possibly the worst thing that could happen, because now she was trapped. She needed to get out, she needed to get out, she needed to get out. Annabeth pressed her hands against the bottom of the ship, trying to find an edge as she kicked her legs. Her nails scraping against the wood was all she could hear in the submerged silence. She gave in and opened her eyes to try and see, no matter how much it was like acid to her eyes, but it was all hopelessly pitch black. Which ship was it? Was it one surrounded by other boats? Her lungs seared with pain like someone was trying to rip them out, the strain of holding her breath for too long. She curled her hands into fists and punched the boat uselessly with the smallest of hopes that someone might hear it. Her stomach rocked up and down, twisting and turning like she was strapped into a roller coaster, and all she wanted to do was scream. She kept stretching her mouth wide open over and over again, but no one could hear her. "Percy," she screamed, but nothing but bubbles came out. Annabeth felt her head get light. She had never felt so helpless before. She could feel the muscles in her body were giving up. How dare they? She kicked again desperately, but didn't move an inch. She had to breathe. The water burned as it flooded her nose like lava down her throat. She choked, trying to throw it back up, only to take in more water. Her head felt like it was about to explode as her body rejected it, heaving and bucking in the water as she tried to be sick again and again. Everything was going purple. She couldn't control her body as it jerked around, pain like she'd never felt tearing her apart from the inside. Her brain pounded against her skull, her blood beating loudly in her ears as she retched. She was sinking. Everything was fading away. Her arms rose up, floating out in front of her. Then nothing. Chapter 20. Percy XII. Percy helped Damason shakily stand up. The giant looked to be able to walk on his own, but Percy doubted he'd be able to for long. Comparing their heights in his head, Percy had a sinking suspicion he'd be used as a crutch for the journey. He looked to Nyx for what to do next. "You misunderstand me," she said, looking almost apologetically at Damason. "The giant cannot come through, he cannot fit." Percy frowned. "What?" he said, confused. Damason stepped backwards. "I'm too big, Percy, I'm 3 times your size, I can't fit through the doors." You knew you couldn't come with me?" Percy asked in disbelief. Damason nodded with a regretful wince. "What happened to staying together?" Percy demanded. Damason was still practically dead on his feet. He needed Percy there to protect him. He had taken care of him when Percy had needed it most, and it was only right for Percy to repay the favor. There is another way across, but only for giants and titans. Damason pressed. You would not make it. This is the only way for you to get across. We can meet up somewhere. Once you get out the other side, just keep going and I'll find you. Percy shook his head, ready to argue further, but Nyx swept forwards, cutting him off. This is the only way, she stated, and it has to happen now. Go! She turned on Damason, waving him off imperiously. The giant bowed his head and heeded her order. He started to limp away. Wait, Percy said. Damason stopped. He raised an exasperated eyebrow at Percy. Take Maya. Percy held the reins out to him. The giant accepted them quietly. I'll see you later. I'll find you, Damason said with an unspoken promise before disappearing through the metal gates. Percy watched, a little sadly, as Maya's tail swept out of sight and turned back, trying to ignore his growing anxiety for both his comrades and his current situation. Little harm should come to him. Nyx glanced at Percy. He is a giant, and if he is rumored to be with you, Godkiller, then perhaps the others shall go out of his way to avoid him. Percy scowled but had to concede the point. Despite his compromised state, Damason was a giant. On the surface, giants couldn't even be killed without both a god and a demigod, and Percy was quite literally the only demigod in the pit of the underworld right now. And Percy didn't have any plans to bump Damason off. Not anymore, a nasty little voice whispered. Percy ignored it. Although he thought with just a trickle of worry, nothing seemed to abide by the rules in this place. Maybe he could be hurt. Percy shook his head clear. He'd be fine, and he had Maya, he would be fine. Where do I go? He turned to Nyx, straightening his back in determination. She smiled at him, not unkindly but not pleasantly. That did not inspire confidence in him. Through the doors and keep going. Do not open your eyes, or do. I am not sure if a mortal could take it. It would be interesting to find out. Percy looked at the mansion again. Some kind of black smoke was coming out the gaps in the doors in wisps. Though that would mean Gaia's rise, Nyx contradicted herself. Better keep them closed then. Yeah, Percy said, still giving the house a once-over. What could actually be inside? Was there furniture, or was it all just like staring into the abyss? Did Nyx actually sleep there? He couldn't imagine cracking open an eye halfway through and just seeing some mundane object like a bookshelf or a wardrobe. Couldn't picture feeling floorboards creaking underneath his feet. Did she have electricity? Scratch that. Did she have a TV, an Xbox? He snorted softly at the thought of the primordial goddess coming home after a long day of what he presumed was murder and settling down on the sofa to play FIFA. Nyx moved in front of him, effectively drawing his attention back to her. Her hand, elegant and covered in sparkling rings, rose to grasp his upper arm tightly. Percy tensed as she didn't let go and resisted the urge to yank it away from her, getting the feeling that would be a bad idea. This may hurt, she warned casually, but it will protect you. Why? Percy fell to his knees with a yell as a searing pain erupted across his arm, the skin seemingly trying to tear itself off and burrow deeper at the same time. Holy Hera, she did not hold back. After a few seconds of Percy biting his lip in agony, she let go. He staggered backwards, landing as gracefully as always on his butt. What was that? He breathed raggedly, gulping breaths in like a drowning man. He turned his arm to see. A mark like a tattoo was there, a solid circle with two crescents on each side, facing outwards, burned black into his skin. Percy gripped the skin as hard as he could to try and alleviate the pain, his eyes watering. What is it? He asked, trying to calm his breathing. A token of luck, a blessing if you will, Nyx said simply. Very, very few have ever received it. It only hurt you because I had to go through that Styx curse of yours. My offspring shall recognize you and most should avoid you. Children that aren't mine may back off on that alone. Percy held his arm for a few seconds. You are welcome, she said, stressing the last word. Thanks, Percy said automatically. Thank you, my lady, he reiterated, this time meaning it, or at least he hoped it sounded like he did. Be aware, it won't make Gaia back off so easily, my little godkiller, Nyx said. Do you know your role in the prophecy in regards to her? Percy shook his head, then amended it grudgingly. I don't know about the prophecy, but Gaia thinks I'll serve her. In the end, she keeps telling me that. And will you? Nyx's tone was curious, but Percy felt the slight chill in the air for a split second. Never, he denied instantly. Nyx looked at him and he felt like he was being x-rayed, or at least not willingly. Nyx pressed her lips together. We shall see. I see many things in your future, as does Gaia, but things can be, lost in translation sometimes. What will come to be may not be as clear as it appears. Percy frowned. He didn't care what Gaia thought she knew, he'd never join her. "What do you see?" he asked, more of a demand than a question, and he winced, ducking his head as Nyx gazed expressionlessly at him, informing him in no such terms that he had overstepped his boundaries. "Sorry," he muttered. "Your future is something you must see and experience yourself. It is time for you to continue your journey there. Now go." Nyx strode across to the doors, whirling around in front of them. Percy, who had been following her, eyed them apprehensively. "Here," she said, clicking her fingers. The doors flew open in a whirlpool of darkness, and unearthly howling emerging. Percy scrunched his eyes instantly and outstretched his hands, fumbling his way towards the doors. She could have given him some warning. He thought, annoyed, running his palms along the doors. He knew instantly when he had fully entered the house. The temperature dropped and his ears popped like he was on an airplane. Goosebumps prickled his skin. He remembered his lack of a shirt. "Oh, and watch out for the river at the end." Nyx's voice, despite the roaring in his ears, was calm and audible, as if she was right in front of him, closing the doors now. The doors banged shut behind him. Percy jumped. He swallowed the lump in his throat and steeled himself. Stepping forwards without knowing what he could be walking into was disconcerting, but Percy shuffled as best he could. The floor was hard. His footsteps were loud, then silent, then loud again. Percy's arms shrank back a little to his sides. Suddenly he really didn't want them outstretched anymore. Noise like TV static seemed to hum in the background. Maybe she had a TV after all, Percy tried to joke in his head, but the hair stood up on the back of his neck the longer he listened to it. It cut out. Then it started up again, lower in pitch and closer. His senses were on overdrive. Percy felt the first inkling of terror trickle through his body. A noise like someone waving their hand down a theremin echoed around. Whispers crept into the silence, but Percy couldn't understand them, couldn't discern individual words. But he knew with an unnerving certainty that the whispers were about him. He didn't know how he knew. Percy cringed, his shoulders shooting up around his ears as a puff of air rolled across his neck. He clenched his eyes shut tighter. Another one on his cheek this time. It smelled like meat. Percy began to breathe a little harder, and it filled the sudden silence like a wailing siren. There was a shuffle to his left. His skin crawled as Percy sensed a presence, like there was someone an inch from his face just waiting. Another puff of air. A breath. Percy couldn't stop walking forwards, wandering like a blind man. The darkness felt tangible, like a thick fog in the air. Was the mansion hollow or something? He hadn't run into any walls or furniture, but the room felt full. Shivers ran up his spine. It was like everything was moving out of his way, just an inch or two to the side, giving him just enough room to walk by. He could feel something watching him, more than one thing. Percy clenched his teeth together. He felt the ghost of a tickle across his sensitive fingertips and snatched his hand up, pressing closely to his chest with his other one. Louder whispers followed that, angry, hateful, spiteful. Percy's fingernails would have definitely been drawing blood in his palms by now if he didn't have the curse of Achilles. A shriek behind him caused him to stumble. He almost opened his eyes but pushed his sweaty palms to the sockets, trying to keep them shut manually. That scream, it was so familiar, but he couldn't put a finger on it. But he knew it. Someone he knew was in there with him. He could still hear it echoing. No, he told himself quietly, for even his thoughts felt like a shout in the dead air around him. No one he knew was here. It was just him. It was just him. Something grabbed his ankle, then let go a split second later. Percy yelped, deafening to his ears, jerking his foot up and off the floor. He picked up the pace a little, feeling that if he stopped, he'd never get out alive. A high-pitched buzzing filtered into the atmosphere, Percy only noticing when it became louder than the other nasty little sounds he could hear. It sounded like a light bulb that had been left on for too long. It seemed to burrow into his ears, raw and piercing. The noise of smashing glass. The buzzing stopped. Percy's spine was stiff and unyielding, and he clutched his hands together tighter to his chest. A scream to his right erupted into existence, then cut off like a flip of a switch. It didn't echo. Percy felt sick with fear. It took everything in him to not turn around and sprint back to the doors, pound on them and plead for Nyx to let him out. But he couldn't go back. He didn't even know if she would let him out. The thought of stopping was scarier than continuing to move, so he kept going. His face twitched. He knew his hair wasn't long enough yet to brush against his nose like that. He jerked himself forwards. He prayed it was forwards. There was a horrible feeling in his nerves that he was just walking in a circle while everything around him watched. His eyes ran around the back of his eyelids. There was no tinge of orange-red that came with the sensation of light against his eyes. Everything was just intensely black. He really was walking in pure darkness. He tried to reach out with his powers, searching for the feeling of blood. He could feel some dotted around, but they weren't like in some bodies though. He scrunched his eyes shut in confusion. They felt flatter, floating like puddles but halfway in the air. Like massive blood splatters across the walls. Percy's hands began to shake. He walked faster, grinding his teeth together and forcing his legs to move. He had to get out. He had to open his eyes. He had to get the hell out and just run, just get out, just. Percy slammed into something and without meaning to, opened his eyes instinctively. On a backdrop of total darkness, a white face with sunken pits for eyes somehow stared back at him. Percy screamed. He recoiled, slamming his palms back onto his eyes so hard it hurt, and started sprinting. He was met with no resistance as he ran, as if whatever that thing was had never even been there, its face distorted and twisted. It couldn't see, it didn't have eyes, so why was it looking at him? 1,000 questions howled through his head. What was that? What was it? Where was he? Where the hell was he? Percy stumbled, catching himself on his hands and knees, his breaths coming faster and faster. His eyes remained shut, but his shaking hands splayed against the floor to hold himself up. The ground under his hands was wet and leathery. It felt like skin. He pushed himself up, wiping his hands on his jeans as he ran, arms fully outstretched now. The shrieks increased. Nails were scratched down chalkboards, forks on plates, gates and doors slamming shut, whistling, a clock ticking backwards. And how did he know it was ticking backwards? Percy didn't know, he didn't care anymore. With the way his heart was slamming against his chest, Percy almost felt like he was about to go into cardiac arrest. In the distance ahead of him, he began to hear a throbbing sound like his own disturbed heartbeat echoing back, amplified so powerfully the floor started to vibrate underfoot. The sound filled him with dread, so he figured it must be the right way to go, anything to get out. He stumbled quicker towards it. As the beat got louder, he could smell smoke and heard the flickering of torches on either side. There was light and he could finally see dim colors through his eyelids, but he was still in the mansion. He wasn't opening his eyes, he couldn't see that again or anything else. The throbbing got louder still, sending jolts straight up his spine. Through his rapid inhaling and exhaling, he noticed that the air smelled fresher, or at least not quite as sulfurous. There was something else, too, closer than the deep poolsing, the feeling of flowing water. Percy's heart raced even faster. This was the river Nyx had told him about, then the exit was close. He began to run faster until he could feel that the river was right in front of him, hurtling at an incredible speed. The noises and presences had faded, they didn't seem to lurk around here. Percy chewed his lip madly, hating the inactivity that came with standing at the edge. As far as he could tell, the opposite side was about 20 feet away. And there was something wrong with the water. He listened carefully. Within the roaring current, thousands of voices cried out, shrieking in agony, pleading for mercy. Help, they wailed, the pain, make it stop. Percy knew all the other rivers of Tartarus had been in enough of them. That meant there was only one left, the ache something. Pain, that was all he could guess about it, because the things, people or souls or whatever they were that were in it did not seem to want to be. Join us, a voice whispered, you are no better than we are. Percy's head was instantly flooded with images of all the monsters he'd killed over the years, taking him by surprise. That wasn't murder, he protested, I was defending people. The river changed course through his mind. His mother being taken by Hades, Grover being kidnapped by the Cyclops, Annabeth snatched to hold the sky up. Bianca dying in the collapse of the metal giant. He had promised to try his best to protect her, and he had failed. Could he not have stopped her, truly, if he had held her back, done her task instead? Everyone who had died in the Battle of Manhattan, he'd had the curse of Achilles then too. Why had they even needed to be there? The crushing guilt of Luke. You could have prevented it, the river told him. You're the weakest demigod, the stupidest, the most pathetic. Percy scrunched his eyes shut tighter. Their blood is on your hands, the river wailed. There was another way, there was always another way, you weren't smart enough to figure it out. No, Percy murmured, he'd had Gabe tell him that he was stupid every day for years, that he could ignore, that he knew how to block out. He needed to focus on the river. Your friends are dead, the river cried, you abandoned them. Percy dug his fingernails into his palms, shaking his head. That's not true, he whispered. Why was he talking to a river? I saved Annabeth. Or did you? The river cried. I know I did, he said, his voice as brittle as ice. At what cost? The river screamed in the very depths of his mind, causing him to see what wasn't there. He saw Apate in her final moments, but from another's perspective. He saw the goddess cowering on the floor. He saw a tall, unrecognizable figure towering menacingly before her, imposing, scary, with eyes like ice, golden ichor splattered across their chest, thoroughly soaked in blood, a drenched sword in their hand, the other outstretched, playing with life and death, grinning coldly as they tortured an immortal. Him. Godkiller, the river hissed, you're supposed to be down here, you wanted to do it, you enjoyed it, come in, join us. Percy felt himself drop to his knees. No, he had to, she had, he needed, it was too, he. Pulling the last bit of strength he had out of who knows where, he split the river in half and shakily slid down to the riverbed. The floor was smooth, but every step was torture. The urge, the niggling bug in his mind to let the river fall, let the screams embrace him, just let it all be over. It was too much for just one person to bear, surely. At some point he fell, moisture trickling down his cheeks as he choked, pushing himself forwards. Droplets of the river water sprayed like cinders onto him. Each drop burned. Eventually, his hands met the other side finally, and he heaved himself up, crawling and coughing on all fours until he no longer could hear the voices. Percy braced himself to open his eyes. He let out a shuddery breath, feeling almost like he was about to curl up and sob. He was out, he blinked and hesitantly looked around. After the darkness of the mansion, even the dim red glow of Tartarus seemed blinding. Before him stretched a valley big enough to hold the San Francisco Bay. The booming noise came from the entire landscape, as if thunder were echoing from beneath the ground. Under poisonous clouds, the rolling terrain glistened purple with dark red and blue scar lines. It looked like, the heart of Tartarus. The center of the valley was covered with a fine black fuzz of peppery dots. They were so far away, it took him a moment to realize he was looking at an army, thousands, maybe tens of thousands of monsters gathered around a central pinpoint of darkness. It was too far to see any details, but Percy didn't even have to guess what the pinpoint was. Even from the edge of the valley, he could feel its power tugging at his soul. The doors of death.